Lovely. All right. Good morning on this election day in Australia. So here we have Prakashika and Purna today. They're going to talk to us about Carol Bowman's work and rebirth in general and past life memories. So a little bit about Prakashika. I've personally known Prakashika for a long time, since I think maybe the first year I came to the Buddhist Center. But Prakashika was born into a secular family in Israel and moved to Sydney in her mid-20s to live with her partner. She discovered Buddhism through reading the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying, which might be some other people's experience too. This subsequently led her to walk through the doors of the Sydney Buddhist Center in 2002. She found meditation and Dharma had a transformative effect, and after a few years, quit her career in software development to work in a Buddhist context. She was ordained in 2009, managed the Sydney Buddhist Center for a few years, and had served on the management team at the Sydney Buddhist Center. She teaches meditation and Buddhism and leads retreats through the Sydney Buddhist Center and enjoys going on solitary retreats. She's a member of the Australian Women's Ordination Team and was recently made a private preceptor. Prakashika is also, I think, the first or only person who's translated Sangharakshita's work, What is the Dharma, into Hebrew. So she's, I think a pioneer in many ways, as well as a really hardworking order member, I'd say, is my impression of Prakashika. So it's lovely to have you here. And then, of course, we have Purna. So a lot of you would know Purna already. He was attracted to Buddhism as a teenager and traveled to India in his early 20s to find a Buddhist meditation teacher. And then when he returned to New Zealand, he connected with Sangharakshita's a survey of Buddhism, and then listened to his many lectures and recordings he was able to get a hold of. He was ordained into the Triratna Buddhist order in 1975, so a few years before Prakashika, and this happened during the course of Sangharakshita's first visit to New Zealand. He had a varied ordered life. He's lived for periods in the UK, in India, and New Zealand, and he now lives in Auckland, New Zealand, on an offshore island called Waiheke, along with his partner Malini, who's also here. He's a private preceptor and a public preceptor, and is currently part of a team responsible for the men's training for ordination process in New Zealand and Australia. So collectively, they have a lot of experience, and we're very lucky to have you here today. It's wonderful. Welcome. Thank you. And welcome everyone who's just joined us. So I'll hand it over to you as I spotlight you too. Thank you.
So I'll start saying a little bit about introducing Carol Bowman, but before that, it's lovely to see so many familiar faces, people I've known for quite a long time in many cases. So Carol Bowman, I'm hoping that you might have seen something of it, but in case you haven't, she's an author, lecturer, counsellor, past life regression therapist, basically a pioneer in reincarnation studies. Her two books are Children's Past Lives and Return from Heaven. They've become something of classics in the area of reincarnation studies for those who are interested. Very popular. They've been translated into something like 23 different languages. So that is a considerable achievement. Carol built up on the earlier work from Dr. Ian Stevenson. Ian Stevenson stood out in terms of he was very, very much trying to use what he thought of as scientific protocols to try and investigate children's past life. And he did thousands of these. Carol's been less concerned with the question of proof, which may never be to a strict standard anyway, being the whole nature of what we're dealing with here. But Carol's focus has been very much on therapy, or the therapeutic use of past life regression for adults, or listening to children who appear to be displaying past life memories. That's been very much the thrust of her work. Trauma release, etc. Some of you may have come across her. There's a very well-known story of the reincarnation of a World War II fighter pilot called James Leininger. Carol was very involved in that story emerging. So to start the session, I'd very much like to put it back on a more personal level with both Prakashika and myself, but we'll start with you, Prakashika, in terms of what's been your journey in the question of past lives.
Thanks, Perna. Yeah, so I have to say up front, I haven't got any memories of a past life, so you're not going to get any scoops here. In fact, my default assumptions around life and death were very much based on my secular upbringing and the prevailing scientific materialistic view that basically when you die, the lights go out and that's the end of consciousness. And I have to say, I quite like the idea that there was this horizon beyond which this world, for better or for worse, was not my problem. I wasn't in any hurry to get there, but I really liked the idea that, in Buddhist terms, we call it the end of suffering. So there was this guaranteed end of suffering. I was a bit worse than just being agnostic, I have to say. I was quite contemptuous of the suggestion that there was anything after death. I regarded it as a primitive belief, or at best some kind of a psychological crutch for people who couldn't face up to the reality of death. So when I came across Buddhism in my 30s, I had a huge kind of this is it response to the Dharma. But I was really quite disappointed to discover that even this profound and generally science-compatible religion had the notion of rebirth. It really spoilt it for me. But slowly through reading and on reflection, I had to admit that my views on the subject of life and death were just as unprovable as the view that there is something after death, and that in fact science didn't have any proof for what happens after death either. They are views rather than facts. So once I relaxed a little bit around the suggestion of rebirth, I started seeing some positives to it. It meant that I wasn't inherently and exclusively defined by my family and nationality and gender and so on. It looked like we were more like just guests in different situations, in different lifetimes. And I liked the implication of tolerance and empathy that followed from this view. If it means that next time or previous life, I could be, in a completely different environment, in a different place, in a different body, in a different gender, different race, different culture. It meant that everything was much more fluid and connected. And this perspective gives rise to more tolerance and compassion. But I still regarded this whole topic of rebirth or reincarnation, as it's sometimes known, as it was merely a working assumption for me. I thought, yeah, okay, so this could be the case. It was only when I started reading up about children who recalled past lives that I started realizing that this wasn't a philosophical or a doctrinal question. This was, by all accounts, a reality experienced by everyday people who otherwise had quite unremarkable lives. There was this whole body of evidence that Perna mentioned that was collected by researchers from the University of Virginia, who they methodically interviewed thousands of children who recalled past lives. And in many cases, they could identify the deceased person that the child was referring to and verify the details. Now, for some people that is insignificant, but for me, that was, wow, this is for real. So these children mostly remember some obscure life, often a life that ended prematurely in a traumatic way. And they're emotionally attached to that life. They're not just knowledgeable about it. They have unfinished business there. They miss their other family. Sometimes they want the food that their other mommy used to cook. So we're not talking about attention seekers who, purport to remember being Napoleon or Cleopatra. We're talking about very mundane lives that these children recall, and their parents, especially in the West, are usually completely baffled by this. They don't welcome it. It's quite disconcerting for them, and they seek advice on this because they don't know what to do with it. I want to play you a little video clip about one of these researchers and one case that he researched, so that you just get a little taste of what I'm talking about if you haven't come across it before. Here we go.
One of Dr. Tucker's most celebrated cases was a boy he investigated from the Midwest of America.
This is a very interesting case of a boy who had memories of being his grandfather. And he said that God gives you a card to come back. And I guess this is a drawing of the card that he did.
Is it possible to get a property in the top 100 suburbs for under $50 a week and make a tidy profit?
Sorry about that.
Here's
Gus Taylor is the child who drew that card. Since he was a toddler, he has believed that in a past life, he was his own grandfather. Gus is now 10 years old.
When he was about 1.5, I was changing his diaper on his changing table, and he all of a sudden just looked at me and said, "You know, when I was your age, I used to change your diaper." And I went, whoa, this is weird.
Gus was named for his grandfather, and his full name is August. His grandfather had died the year before he was born, so he really didn't, he never got to know his grandfather. But he would insist that he was Grandpa Augie. If we were referring to Grandpa Augie, he would just say, "You mean me?" You know, he was just very adamant, like, we should know that he is Grandpa Augie.
Where's me?
There. There.
Where's me again? See if you can find me somewhere else.
Gus was 4 when Ron was given an old family album. To his parents' astonishment, Gus was able to point out his grandfather in an old school photograph. He also correctly identified this as the first car that his grandfather ever owned.
He showed me a picture, and then I said, that was my first car. And then my dad was like, that's weird, because the car was Grandpa Augie's first car. So it was all scared.
Kathy and Ron were intrigued by their son's ability to identify his grandfather in photos. But one day, Gus told them something that turned their intrigue to shock.
Gus and I were chatting, and he started saying something about Grandpa Augie, which wasn't unusual. And I said to him, when you were Grandpa Augie, did you have any sisters or brothers? He said, well, I had a sister, but she died. And so that sort of caught my attention because, you know, we haven't had any deaths in the family. And he said, well, she died. And I just sort of looked at him and he said, yeah, she turned to a fish. She died, some bad guys.
I just was flabbergasted. I really was just I was speechless because I just couldn't understand how he would know anything about that.
Apparently what happened was his aunt was murdered and her body was dumped into the San Francisco Bay.
There was no way he could know anything about her circumstances and how she died because it was never discussed. And was barely discussed with me, with him, in my family. To hear my son, who didn't know my father, didn't know his aunt who was murdered, speak about this, and because that's when I just went, there's something going on here that I just don't understand.
For many,
So after reading up and watching a lot of documentaries like this online, I really started pondering how much of our personality originates from experiences that most of us can't even remember. How much baggage are all of us carrying in this life, and what does it mean about, you know, our communication with each other and how we understand other people? But what rattled me even more was reading that in some of these cases, the child was born with physical birthmarks or even severe deformities that corresponded to the death wounds of their past life. For example, a child who was born with this straight scar across the back of her head, who remembered a life that ended in brain surgery, or a child with birthmarks on the chest that exactly mapped to the stab wounds documented in the autopsy report of the person whose life they could remember. What does this mean about the way that our bodies come into existence? We know what happened to the dead body. You know, there's no question that it disintegrated back into the elements. So by what means do these marks and deformities carry over from one life to another? What does it say about our physical existence if an injury that happened to a different body with different genetic makeup can physically manifest in a new body? It must follow that the mind is the primary element and the body and maybe matter in general is secondary. There's just no other logical explanation unless you somehow manage to dismiss the evidence, which I couldn't reasonably do. So this completely turned my worldview on its head, and I'm still pondering the implications of this perspective. It's a work in progress. But I know that Perna had a very different journey around this question, and it made a great impression on me hearing him talk about it in the past. So do you want to say something about that, Perna?
Yes, well, unfinished business and coming into this life with baggage is certainly my theme from a very personal level. Before I started school, I used to have recurrent nightmares. They followed a very similar theme, very similar visuals of me trying to hide in rubble from Germans trying to shoot me. The other dream that is of relevance here, when I say dream, actually they were more nightmares. I'd wake myself up in a state of horror, was walking, for some reason, walking into this hospital and seeing this shaven-headed soldier with his back to me, just lying on an iron frame. There wasn't even a mattress there. And me recoiling in complete horror from the figure lying on the bed without understanding why. So that was my early childhood experience of a lot of nightmares associated with things I had no real understanding of. Psychologists would have had a field day with me. When I was about 16, I went to Australia for the first time, and I have a complicated family life. My father actually claimed I wasn't his child. But my father's sisters, my aunties, there seemed to be this big issue of me being, I was definitely my father's child. And of course, the full story emerged. There wasn't just a family resemblance of me to my father's brother. There was, as they said, I was virtually the spitting image of him. They had last seen him before his wounding is about that age of 16. He'd been seriously injured in France in the First World War. He'd actually enlisted, walked out of home without his parents' permission, forged a letter from them to say he had their approval, and got himself to France in the army, the Australian Imperial Forces, as it happened. Got shot, as some like to remind me, with a bullet in the butt. Shipped back to Australia before he eventually died. So that's one sort of thread of the story for me. In the 1990s, I seriously damaged my back to the degree I'd lost the use of my right arm, and I was off work for about 3 months. I was receiving intensive osteopathy and acupuncture at the time, and nothing seemed to be shifting. A locum came into the osteopathy clinic and said she would like to try something different. She's a bit of a healer. She put her hands on my lower back. My injury, I would point out, was in my upper back, completely jammed up the nerves in my right shoulder. But she put her hands on my lower back, around my sacrum area. And almost immediately, I had this sensation of this gaping black hole there. And what was even weirder, I could smell burning flesh. Within days, my injury cleared up. My current life injury to my upper back. I got the use of my arm again. So for years, I kidded myself that there was some psychological explanation for my childhood nightmares. This incident with the osteopath convinced me there's something more going on here. So I formally undertook different forms of past life regression over the years, and it's an area I'm quite familiar with. I vividly relived running in complete terror, and then the slam as a bullet hit my lower back. Reliving the horror of a boat journey back, being in hospital in Sydney, both of which were not at all pleasant experiences. Overall, it left me with very little doubt about what I was dealing with in terms of past life. None of it, of course, is ever provable. But it certainly, for me, it told a story that explained my early childhood nightmares, the complexity of my relationship with my father, and what I'd gone through in that osteopathy session. There was a rather odd aftermath. I've always had an attraction to my dream life. It's always been a very vivid part of me, and I've kept dream diaries since I was a teenager. Looking back over the years, I became aware that there was something odd going on with some of my dreams. The main story of the dream would be playing out, but then I realized I was in a wheelchair. It wasn't the main part of the story. And it wasn't just one or two dreams. There's a whole run of dreams where something else was the main story. But almost incidentally to the story, I happened to be in a wheelchair, taking part in the story. And it was only later that I learned that my father's brother, my uncle, had been in a wheelchair for 2 years prior to his death from the gunshot wound. So, as I said, nothing's provable here, but my focus has been very much on healing. The Context of Rebirth, Past Lives provided me with a story that I was able to integrate something around. And I'm very convinced that this can be a very effective means of healing trauma without getting too sidetracked into the question of proof or not. Its effectiveness is healing, and that to me is the main thrust of Carol Bowman's work. It works. Do you want to say anything more about Carol Bowman, Prakashika? Or?
Well, I think what we'll do next is we'll let her speak for herself. As Perna mentioned, her speciality, Carol Bowman's speciality is in the therapeutic use of past life memories. And it has been her own experience with healing from a chronic lung condition after past life regression therapy. And also both her children, especially if you watch the whole interview, especially the boy who had a phobia of loud noises and recovered from that after recalling a past life, also as a soldier getting injured in battle. So, and also had a physical symptom. He had an eczema on his wrist at the location that he remembered being shot in. And when he recalled these memories, the eczema cleared up. So I think it would be nice to watch the first clip, please, Varadi.
So it's a very different way of looking at personality too, personality formation.
Yeah. I mean, in terms of the trauma and the healing potential of recollection of past lives, how does recollecting past lives help in that healing trauma? Does anything need to be done, or is it simply from your experience and what you've heard? Is it just simply for them to remember and for that to be understood?
Not in itself. And it works very much the same way as trauma in this life. So one of the things that I suggest, which is critical, is allow the child to talk about their memories. Don't shut them down. And a lot of parents in the West are totally freaked out by this. They think it's dangerous for a child to remember or to talk about it. But I found the opposite. Sometimes the soul needs to express this. That's why it's coming up. Because the soul wants to heal. Healing is needed. So if you address it as an opportunity and allow the child to talk about it and use open-ended questions, not planting suggestions, But this is where my counseling background came in handy, just reflecting back what they're saying. Oh, you died in a fire. What happened? Or, I used to have a wife and children. Oh, really? Tell me about them. Just allow the child to talk about it. And then, I kind of just stumbled onto this technique, which I think really helps, is because children are close to these memories in consciousness, there's this stream of consciousness that carries over. And the way they talk about these memories when they're 2, 3, and 4 is sometimes in the first person, as if this event is in current time. So they don't necessarily know that they made a transition through death into a new body. So if you can help them clarify that in very simple language, say, if they're talking about it, say, yeah, well, that's something that happened before, and give them assurances if they need to feel safe. I will protect you, or you're safe now. You're now safe in a new body. This can work like magic.
Because
I can help them process it.
Yeah. Because I suppose and I know you get asked this all the time, but so say you are a mum and your child starts talking like that. How do you know that they're not just in a fantasy? Obviously, kids have very concrete imaginal worlds. So how do you know, actually, this is different? This is a memory of a past life, not just a fantasy or something that they're creating.
And you might not initially know in that moment, when a lot of mothers go into shock. When you hear a child, a 2 or 3-year-old, talk about how they died, that's usually that's the direct tip off. That you're in a past life memory if they're talking about how they died before, but that they may not start the conversation in that way. So if they say something shocking about when I was here before, when I was big, or when I was a girl, a boy saying when I was a girl, or vice versa, or when I was a mommy, listen and don't shut them down. Ask open-ended questions. See if they're troubled by the memory. They may not be, which is fine. And it might explain a lot about your child's personality, knowing where they've been. So if they talk about, oh, when I was big before, I had a farm, and I had horses. Oh, that's nice. You don't have to do anything with that one necessarily until they say, and then we had a fire and we all died. Then you might need to reassure them that they're now safe in a new body, for example. Some kids remember positive experiences, which can explain current abilities or talents or wisdom. We're not coming in as blank slates. That's the obvious thing. And there's also a tone of voice that children use when they talk about these memories. They're very matter of fact. Sometimes they sound a little more grown up, and sometimes they will use words outside of their so far learned vocabularies.
Yeah.
Or talk about things that there's no way in the world they could know about at age 2, 3, or 4.
So thanks for that, Prakashika. I think a key point for me is we're not coming in as blank slates. Some of us have unfinished business, and that it's not that we all need to be doing past life regression for whatever reason, but for some of us, there are strands of our personality that are much more than our current conditioning, our current upbringing, hereditary factors even. There is, for some of us, another thread. And it's a question of taking notice of this when appropriate, giving it its, as Carol says, listening to children, not dismissing them. There was a second clip that I think is worth playing here. Could we, Verity, could we move into that?
I mean, how common is it? Because obviously, you put the ad out in the magazine, Mothering, I think it's called, and you got all these experiences, and you got, you started to take interest, and you know how you see things when you take interest. How common do you think it is for kids to spontaneously remember their past lives?
I think it's probably very common. There are no good statistics as far as I can tell, and there are people who have been studying this, Ian Stevenson's colleagues or proteges. I'm not one, because I went into a different direction with it. I'm not trying to prove every case. And that's what his camp is doing. They're looking at cases that can be verified, where the children remember enough specific names, details, that they can establish the former identity and match, what carried over. Is this a real memory? But they go to extremes. And after Stevenson published, hundreds of cases that are amazing, I'm going beyond, let's try to prove this. He's already done it. So I'm saying, wow, look at the healing potential of these memories. The soul wants to heal. We're given this incredible opportunity when our children are young to let them let go of this baggage they brought in through past life trauma. And that's really been my focus. And not enough people are acknowledging that yet, in my opinion. There are a lot of really great past life therapists in the Netherlands who are going in that direction with children, in other parts, probably in the UK too. But there just aren't enough people who take it seriously in the way, the psychological community, the medical community is set up. They're not. There's no code for this in their world. There's no description in the manuals. So it hasn't been widely accepted, but parents get desperate enough, they'll seek me out or other people doing this research to just get a reality check. But unfortunately, I don't know of anybody else who's written a book or even articles about the healing potential. So that's kind of I feel like that's my mission, as long as I can keep doing. And the books are out there and they're still in print. But it's so important because I'm looking at the deeper meaning of these memories. And it's endless. And, I'm just scratching the surface. I mean, I hope other people continue this work and can find more too and write about it.
Yeah, so the phenomenon of rebirth can seem quite threatening to people in our culture. And as Bowman points out, it does actually offer a lot of opportunities, but they're not just on the level of psychological healing. That's what I found interesting in what she goes on to say. There are also opportunities in it in terms of spiritual and ethical growth, where it starts to be particularly relevant for us as practitioners. So let's hear one more snippet from Carol Bowman, please, Verity.
What are the kind of common themes that you think that you've discovered in your research about these memories?
Common themes. Well, there are many universal themes we all share. And I think, in the broader sense, consciousness continues after death, no question. And aspects of personality carry over after death, which is really quite remarkable. And I know, Hinduism, Buddhism they're different takes on this. But from just the children's memories, I can see that there is some continuity. in consciousness and in personality.
Mm.
And trauma from the past can carry over, as well as wisdom, compassion.
Mm.
So there are these bigger patterns. You know, what are we doing here? What's this all about? And another thing I found is there's no straight line of evolution, in my opinion. I mean, I do believe in, what is it, the vertical path where you can suddenly become enlightened. But as far as reincarnation, it's like, what I think happens in some lives, we progress, you know, become more aware, more conscious, but then we can fall back. Maybe we're in just a totally awful situation where we lose our bearings, we lose faith, whatever that means for people. So it's, you know, we could have a setback, but it's still a learning experience. You know, there's nothing lost unless you get totally locked into a certain pattern. And sometimes these patterns do repeat. And I've seen that with the physical symptoms in my own life. You know, I can, because I've done a lot of past life work, I've seen multiple lifetimes in which I died with trauma to the lungs through different, you know, in gas chamber, consumption, hanging. So patterns can get locked into place.
And do you think that recollecting these lives can really help shift that?
Absolutely. And I've had a past life therapy practice with adults. I do not regress children. I counsel parents how to talk to their children, help them with their spontaneous memories, but I experimented early on regressing my own children and some of my friends' kids just to see what would happen. And I don't do that. And I really don't suggest parents do that. You know, don't try to bring up the memories, you know, don't try to put them in, you know, use hypnosis or something, because if you aren't trained, you're not going to know how to help them if they get into trauma. But if the kids are remembering these things spontaneously, parents are in the best position to help them. So when they bring it up, if they know how to talk to a child, they can help their own children. And that's why I wrote the books, for parents, not academics. I don't care what the academics think, or the scientists.
Well, yes, and reading it, there was one sentence that you said that really struck me, which is, proof is not the point, healing and growth and understanding are the point. And I really got that from you. You're not trying to prove anything. You're just you tell a lot of stories which are absolutely gripping.
So the emphasis in terms of the understandings Carol's bringing to us is the possibility, or us to allow the possibility that there's a continuity of consciousness. Interestingly, Carol says there are aspects of personality that carry over from one life to another. She is not saying we are the same person. We, as we currently experience ourselves, are a product of a lot of conditions. The dominant ones being, of course, the family we're born into and the culture we're born into. But it's allowing for the possibility of there being aspects of our personality that may not be from the current life, that I see as the emphasis here. What's the learning for us as Buddhist practitioners? Do you have any thoughts on this, Prakashika?
Well, it's really interesting to think about this in a Buddhist context. I think some people might be really surprised to hear that there's a great deal of controversy in Western Buddhist circles, including our own, around the question of rebirth. It's not at all something that everyone accepts at face value or at all. There are different teachings on the subject, on the subject of rebirth in Buddhist tradition, and many different possible and impossible interpretations of them. Now, I'm not a scholar by any definition, but in a rash moment, I offered to say a little bit about what I understand as the Buddhist position on this, just to put it into context for us as practitioners. So when the Buddha described the lead up to his own awakening, so this is before he awoke to what's known as enlightenment, he described going into very deep meditation and then recalling past lives. And he says, I recollected my manifold past lives. That is 1 birth, 2, 5, 10, 50, 100, 1,000, 100,000, many eons of cosmic contraction, many eons of cosmic expansion. There I had such a name, belonged to such a clan, had such an appearance. Such was my food, such my experience of pleasure and pain, such the end of my life. Passing away from that state, I re-arose there. There too I had such a name, etc., etc. Passing away from that state, I re-arose here. Thus I recollected my manifold past lives in their modes and details. What I think is significant about this description is that the Buddha actually talks in terms of I and mine. I was born, such was my name, my clan, my appearance, etc. I died, I re-arose. And this is not much different to the way that these young children speak about their own past lives. And they also see them in terms of me and mine, as Carol Bowman was saying. Sometimes they don't even realize that they're not the same person, not the same body anymore. So it might be useful to say then that from an ordinary, unenlightened perspective, past lives seem to be different states that a person or a personality goes through from an ordinary perspective. We do the same in this life as well. We identify with our past and interpret the continuity of experience as being a fixed personality. Here's me, and I go through time. You know, so we may say, I was a baby, I was a child, you know, I went to school, this was my house, this was my career, etc. But as you probably know, after his enlightenment, the Buddha went on to teach anatman, or no self, the doctrine of no self. From an enlightened perspective, you might say, to put it very simplistically, you could say, instead of what I just described, you could say a process of Buddhahood, a process of babyhood morphed into a process of childhood. A process of education evolved into a routine of adulthood. But there is no me to be found who owns this process. There's just a play of evolving that gives rise to more evolving. So the phenomena is the same, okay? The experience is the same. A life is lived exactly the same, but from one perspective we interpret it as me and mine, and from another perspective we interpret it as there just being an evolving experience, but no entity that experiences it. And it's a similar thing with rebirth. You know, some people think that because the Buddha taught that there is no self, it means that there can't be rebirth, because who is reborn? And it's a real conundrum if you are locked into thinking in terms of me and mine. But you could just see this process as a series of states that arise and pass into another state, and they each condition the next state. I mean, even to talk about states doesn't really do it justice, but language is quite limited like that. But the question is, what drives this endless process of becoming? And this is where we get to the crux of the matter from from a Buddhist point of view. The Buddha suggests that if we completely and truly penetrated the truth of no self in all its subtlest forms, the compulsion to be reborn would come to an end. Okay, we might choose to be reborn to help other people realize the truth, but we wouldn't be compelled to circle helplessly through birth and death and birth and death and birth and death forever. That is the ultimate release from suffering that the Buddha describes. You could say that the reason we are reborn is because we fail to understand our own nature, our mind's nature, the nature of existence, the harmful power of our attachment to embodied existence, our attachment to experience. And this is what the Buddha says, talking not just about us, but about himself. He says, because it is through not realizing, through not penetrating the Four Noble Truths, that this long course of birth and death has been passed through and undergone by me as well as by you. It is through not realizing, through not penetrating the Four Noble Truths, that this long course of birth and death has been passed through and undergone by me as well as by you. So I'd love to go more into this and more into other Buddhist traditions' perspective on this, like the Tibetan Book of the Dead, but we won't have time to do that this morning. So I'll hand over to Perna at this point.
The only qualification I'd put here is the question in my mind, did the Buddha actually teach there is no self? Or did he teach that there is no permanent self independent of the flow of experience? Atma presupposes there's something outside of our current experience that we could call a self. It's not denying that we have a current experience. But anyway, that's all perhaps a bit too nitpicky on my part. One of the implications of past life work on my side is not so much, oh, wow, I had a past life, but the sobering realization that what I'm doing now may be impacting a future life. What we do matters. The creative use we make of this life matters. The way we respond to what happens to us matters. So we've formulated a series of questions suggested for the breakout groups, which I think, Varadi, you've got. Are you able to? There's a Google document there that Varadi is pointing to. Not everyone may be able to access that. Hopefully you can. But there's a series of 3 questions that we're going to suggest for the breakout groups. Let's say about 15 minutes in breakout groups. Where on the spectrum of belief in past lives and rebirth do you find yourself? It's not always a quick, clear-cut question of believing or not believing. But where in the spectrum of belief do you find yourself? Second point was, are there aspects of personality in our life or that of others we know that cannot be fully explained by hereditary and environmental factors? So this is looking at the question of nature and nurture and how do we explain Mozart composing a symphony at 6 years old type of thing. Or within our own experience of our personality. In our family, how do we account for there being such difference? And so the third one is, assuming we're going to have future lives, which of our personality patterns would we want to carry over or not to carry over? So I suggest we just 15 minutes or so, let's break into groups and share what you're willing to out of those three questions.